The Soviet war in Afghanistan wasn't called Brezhnev's war, nor was the war in Chechnya called Yeltsin's war. I don't think Putin is the reason for the phenomena that have made the war in Ukraine possible. At least he is not the only reason and not even the main reason, I would say. Putin and his current surrounding all come from what appears at first glance to be a wild alliance between reformers and law enforcement actors, so-called civilians. That alliance formed back in the days of Boris Yeltsin, and there is a lot of Russian reformers were aware that they could never remain in power using electoral mechanisms. Russian law enforcement found many things in the Russian version of capitalism that they could use to transform their corporate privileges into personal benefits for themselves and for their children, both literally and figuratively speaking. Putin became prime minister under Boris Yeltsin, and the 2000 election was hardly a triumph of democracy. It was Anatoly Chubais, one of the engineers of Russia's reforms, who began elaborating the concept of liberal empire. The engineers of Perestroika chiefly viewed liberalism as an approach to the market rather than something to do with democracy. The ugly 1996 election, the abolition of regional elections, the Chechen war, all the things happened before Putin time for reasons that are much more profound than the biography of one individual who grew up in Leningrad. Russian liberalism was never democratic. It was elitist and relied on state engineering. This paves the way to over-concentration of power and eventually to decisions like the one taken in February this year. Come to think of it, the decision to start the war in Chechnya was also taken by Yeltsin single-handed. The difference is that Chechnya didn't even compare to Ukraine in significance, and 1994 is not 2022. One can thus argue that Putin isn't the reason of the phenomenon, but rather the result. When viewed from the post-Soviet space, Russia looks different from different countries because each of them has its own structures and issues and its own geopolitical environment. However, all these perspectives have something in common. Russia is the region's former imperial center and current geopolitical kind. Consolidated authoritarian regimes aren't unusual into the former USSR. And leaders who stay in power for decades are more of a rule than an exception. The harshness of regimes varies from Turkmenistan to Belarus, and Russia isn't at any of extremes. If we look beyond the post-Soviet world to its neighbor states to find the same picture, from Afghanistan to China, they aren't the most developed democracies. For example, my country, Armenia, has 4 neighbors, 3 of them with idiosyncratic regimes. Azerbaijan has been ruled by a dynasty since 1969. Iran has a complicated theocratic system in which religious leaders have leverage over foreign and domestic politics. Turkey has recently been raising new concerns, at least among its neighbors. Our countries don't border on Switzerland and Luxembourg. Our neighbors' regimes are our given, just like our geographic setting. Looking from Washington, one can deny that Taliban-ruled Afghanistan is a state. When one lives in Tajikistan, one has to reckon with what Afghanistan represents. Similarly to post-Soviet countries, Russia's domestic structure is either a topic for moralizing that has nothing to do with concern about Russian liberalism or democratic futures, or a topic for academic research, including for people like us. Russia's size and resources, meanwhile, cannot be ignored. However, In the varied geopolitical settings of part of the former empire, it mattered a lot whether your country bordered on China or Poland. Attitudes to Russia were accordingly. For example, there is a contrast between countries that border on Russia and ones that don't. The ones that do are exposed to greater risks, regardless of the regime. I would say that the former USSR countries that have traveled the farthest from Russian influence are Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, for both their geopolitical and demographic reasons. With their high birth rates, they have young populations that no longer remember the USSR. As to domestic politics, moving away from the USSR doesn't have to be toward modernization, it can be toward archaic practices. With China and Afghanistan as one's neighbors, one has perceived threats. They can only be balanced by Russia, and Russia's regime makes no difference. In the South Caucasus, we witness cautious complementary policies with countries trying to maintain equilibrium among various regional and global powers. The South Caucasus, by its structure, is a triangle of relatively small countries, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, surrounded by three larger regional powers, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And they are not just countries, all three regional powers are former empires that at some point in time ruled over the South Caucasus or parts of it. This fact leads to atavistic attitude and sentiments that our countries don't have the luxury to reflect on the rather peculiar politics regimes of our former imperial powers. The western part of the former USSR is the zone of direct rivalry between the West and Russia. The war in Ukraine is, of course, a radical form of rivalry. But if we look at Belarus or Baltic states or Moldova, we can see that they too are situated on the tectonic boundaries between the West and Russia, and that this fact defined most of their foreign policy agenda, and to some extent also the domestic one. Given the post-colonial sentiments and the varying practices, there are discourses in all post-Soviet countries that rejects Russia and its policies. Anti-Russian sentiments is usually more common in urban areas and especially in capital cities and amongst younger and more educated people. However, one shouldn't overestimate it. Media and social networks aren't the best source of data on political trends. My country is a vivid illustration. The 2018 Velvet Revolution in Armenia was led by the very social stratum that I have just described, urban pro-Western civil society, young pro-Western civil society actors. As an opposition member of parliament, our present-day Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan voted against Armenian secession to the Eurasian Economic Union and repeatedly criticized Armenian membership in CSTO. However, after the revolution, Armenia didn't drop out of Eurasian Economic Union or CSTO, and following the Second Karabakh War, Armenia's dependence on Russia became stronger than it had been before the Velvet. In the final analysis, there are sentiments and discourses, but there are also relative sizes and capacities. I believe it unlikely that once Putin stepped down, Russia will suddenly take a turn to democracy. Liberalism, policy of living its former colonies in peace. This would be in contrast to everything I know about this country, its history and politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect. So next we'll hear from GW's own Sufian Zhemukhov, who's going to talk about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, second order effects of the Russia-Ukraine war.
See this slide? With everybody's eyes on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many experts wonder how these events, what second order effects this event have in the former Soviet Union. And I will focus on breakaway regions of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, and how these events, how the war affected these regions. I'll first talk about the Caucasus version of irredentism. Then we'll compare the behavior of big powers, Russian-Georgian war in 2008 and Russian 22. And then I'll compare South Ossetia and Abkhazian similarities and differences, and dig a little bit into the archaeology of referendum holding in South Ossetia and compare it with other referendums. So the two regions that I will talk about are breakaway regions of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. Both are on the border with Russia. And in case of South Ossetia, what this map doesn't show is there is a continuation of the same size on the Russian border, which is called North Ossetia. That's why it's south in that picture. And the same way as Russia invaded Ukraine and the international community supported Ukraine in the ongoing war, in 2008, there was invasion of Russia in Georgia, so it will be a good exercise to compare those. In both cases, Russian troops moved deep in the country's territory and just fall short of taking capitals. Kiev in 2022 and Tbilisi in 2008. In the case of Ukraine, Russia annexed territories. When I was preparing this presentation, I was going to talk about only Crimean annexation, but today we know that 4 more territories have been annexed. While in Georgia's case, the territories were not annexed. At the same time, in Georgia's case, Russia recognized independence of breakaway regions, and it did the same with Ukraine. First recognized Luhansk and Donetsk independence, and then very shortly recognized Kherson and Zaporizhia independence, and then instantly annexed them. However, the interesting trend is that in case of Georgia, the recognition happened after the war, which lasted 5 days, while in case of Ukraine, it either happened before the war or nowadays happened during the war. And probably one of the most important differences is that the Russian-Georgian war lasted 5 days, while Russian-Ukrainian war has been already going for 7 months. If we talk about the current stage, or 80 years, if we talk about Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. In both cases, the United States imposed sanctions against Russia. However, besides with the length of the war, one of the main differences is that in 2008, United States was ready to send troops and actually send military battleship to Black Sea, and the United States was ready to support Georgia with militaries, while in the case of Ukraine, from the beginning, United States expressed unwillingness to do that. Comparing South Ossetia and Abkhazia, we can see that almost a lot of similarities, including that both South Ossetia and Abkhazia supported Russia's actions. They hosted refugees. They recognized Donetsk and Luhansk, with slight nuances, like South Ossetia recognized Donetsk and Luhansk early in 2014, while Abkhazia waited until Russia recognized them. Also, the supporting of Russia's action had different rhetorics, but those are very small nuances. Also, both reinforced Kremlin's propaganda, but Abkhazian leadership was more careful in using the same rhetoric that the Kremlin used. The president of Abkhazia tried to avoid such terminology as neo-Nazis, and however, he was calling it operation instead of war. More importantly, what I wanted to focus about is how the war in Ukraine affected the local elections, domestic politics, and we can say that in case of South Ossetia, it directly affected, and I'll talk more about it. While in case of Abkhazia, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were parliamentary elections, and they were not affected in any ways by this war. So a number of post-Soviet regions asked in different times to join Russia. So the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Crimea, Transnistria, South Ossetia asked, this is not correct, actually, they asked 4 times, not 3 times. And Abkhazia also expressed willingness to join Russia in 1995 and 2001. However, there was really one important difference when in 2022, Abkhazian leadership publicly expressed that Abkhazia would not join Russia, and that is an important development. And now I'd like to dig into this referendum that took place in South Ossetia, because this is probably the most direct, one of the most direct effects that a Russian invasion of Ukraine had on other former Soviet Union regions. So you can see here 2 people, Anatoly Bibilov, who was president of South Ossetia when Russia invaded Ukraine, and he was facing elections, and he was extremely unpopular. He was so unpopular that his own ally, former President Eduard Kakachia, was accusing him, was organizing rallies against him, not to mention others. All other candidates, there were 8 candidates, they joined against Bibilov, and they said, if any of us wins the first round of elections, we're going to support him. So, like, Bibilov was extremely unpopular. And on February 28, he heard from Leonid Pasechnik, the head leader of Luhansk, talking about holding referendum in Luhansk in the morning. And in the evening, apparently somebody talked him out of it. He again talked the same evening and said that he misspoke. He didn't mean that he wanted to hold a referendum. However, that gave really good idea to Anatoly Bibilov, who started talking about holding a referendum. And 2 days later, he proposed a referendum. and he met some skepticism, saying that South Ossetians hold a new referendum every time they have new elections. On May 8th, there were presidential elections. And on May 13th, on the last day of his time in office, Anatoly Bibilov actually signed a decree announcing referendum. However, as soon as his successor, Alan Valiyev, stepped in, he canceled this referendum. So we can see how referendum became a tool for elections of one person. So we can say it was a referendum to save Bibilov's face instead of a real referendum. United States representatives clearly called it illegitimate. Chris Coons, the senator who's mostly involved in Georgian affairs, called it a sham, while the embassy and Department of State spokesman called it illegitimate. At the same time, Russia also was not excited about it, and Dmitry Peskov instantly said that there are no actions have been taken. And after the same day, when Bibilov proposed referendum, Konstantin Zatulin, who is mostly involved in Georgian breakaway regions affairs, very emotionally said Bibilov did wrong. It was like a very emotional statement. And to conclude, what this referendum shows us. Actually, this referendum that didn't happen created a new status quo which allowed all actors in this region to clarify their position, maybe with exception of Georgia. So we have the old status quo before March 30, before referendum was announced, and then referendum and terminals elections coinciding, and on May 30 we have new status quo when Abkhazia reaffirmed its movement toward independence. South Ossetia expressed a willingness to join Russia, even though referendum was not even cancelled. Actually, it was postponed. So even the wording shows South Ossetian clear position. At the same time, Russia moved to annexing Ukrainian regions, but decided not to annex Georgian regions. Georgia's position was the only one that remained the same. It's ambivalent, no war, no peace kind of, and last but not least, the United States support of Georgia's territorial integrity withstood all these tumultuous referendum and election. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sufian. The next up, we have Anar from the University in Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me? I have 8 minutes around, right?
Yes.
Okay, I will stick exactly to the 8 minutes. Okay, so exactly on November 10th, Azerbaijan and Armenia will commemorate 2 years since the trilateral agreement when that ended Karabakh War. This Karabakh War, 44-day Karabakh War, has resulted in the thousands of deaths, both from Armenian side and from the Azerbaijani side, led to the numerous casualties, and definitely led to the economic downturn. So, but for the last 2 years, the situation didn't improve, specifically because the animosity between the two states still remain at the high level. Recent escalations of the military, I mean, there were several escalations between Armenia and Azerbaijan back in 2021 and in 22. Exactly on September 13 and 14, that led to another 100 people deaths from both sides. So telling us that even though that there's a Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh, and though there's a trilateral agreement on the ceasefire, still there's a lot of things happening between the two countries and whether we can reach the peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia within a very short period of time, especially in the time of the Ukrainian crisis. So let me just give you a couple of the kind of statements of what are the basic fight between Azerbaijan and Armenia related to the principles of the peace agreement. Based on Azerbaijani side understanding that the Karabakh conflict is over. Azerbaijan won the war, Azerbaijan deoccupied its territory. Certain areas are still under the control of the Russian peacekeepers, but this is for a short period of time. The Russians will leave soon, maybe within 2 or 3 years. And the Karabakh conflict is over, it's Azerbaijani territory. So it's nothing can prevent Azerbaijan to sign peace agreement with Armenia. And Azerbaijani president put forward several principles of the peace agreement. One of them is a recognition of territorial integrity. Azerbaijan recognized territorial integrity of Armenia, Armenia recognized Azerbaijan. Both countries withdrew from their kind of destructive actions against each other, delimitations and demarcation of the borders. And what's most important for Azerbaijan is simply that Karabakh conflict is over. It's my domestic issues. It's not kind of the international kind of the conflict, not anymore. So that's what Azerbaijan is trying to push. Yes, so that was Azerbaijan. But for Armenian side, it's a little bit problematic from this perspective, not from perspective of recognition of territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, but from perspective of recognition that Karabakh conflict is over and Karabakh is a part of Azerbaijan, and there's Armenian side is pushing forward the idea that the rights for Armenians of Karabakh should be respected, and Azerbaijan should take into considerations the, so long period of time struggle of Armenian Karabakh. So this also another kind of a case for Azerbaijan and Armenia. What really brings the two countries to not sign peace agreement is the opening the communication lines. Azerbaijan, if you remember the map of Azerbaijan, there's the exclave of Nakhchivan, and there's the mainland of Azerbaijan, and there's Azerbaijan is trying to kind of build communication between its exclaves of Nakhchivan and mainland of Azerbaijan through the territory of Armenia, so-called, the regions of Sunni of Armenia, Azerbaijan called Zangezur, so so-called corridor within Armenian territory, claiming that this is only for the humanitarian side, it's only for transportations, while Armenian side consider it as one of the dangers to the Armenian territorial integrity and one of the attempts of Azerbaijan and Turkey to cut off Armenia from its border with Iran. So that's another kind of the problematic thing that is happening between the two countries. And the situation was, technically was slowly going toward the, if not peace agreement, but slowly reconciliation between the two countries. When the February 24th invasion happened, that's completely changed the situation in the Caucasus, because right now Russian invasion has reshuffled the dynamics of the South Caucasus and Eurasia overall. And Baku specifically was confronted with a new reality after the outbreak of the war, and with a hard security becoming a more pressing issue for Baku. The war actually revealed a high degree of vulnerability coming from the Russian dominance in the post-Soviet Eurasia. While Moscow has strong tools to affect the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Azerbaijani government responded to the Russian-Ukraine war with balanced approach, but remember that the Russian peacekeepers are still in Karabakh, and that's why we have to take into consideration the Russian interests. Well, the main ramification of this situation, of the specific of the war of Ukraine, crisis in the foreign policy of Azerbaijan, was that Azerbaijan was reduced the space for maneuvering and increased cost risk of maneuvering spaces. The invasion seriously affected and continue to affect the calculations of Baku specifically. Furthermore, the situation is really kind of problematic because Baku is specifically torn apart between the several kind of the centers specifically. From one side, Baku is not, it's recognized the territorial integrity of Ukraine, remembering that the Karabakh issue is also about territorial integrity, but refusing to join any sanctions against Russia, perfectly understanding that Russian troops are located in Karabakh. So because Russia can sporadically and easily create situations when Azerbaijan will need to react, especially in Karabakh. And the situation right now in specifically with Karabakh and with Armenia and Azerbaijan, is that if Russia gets stronger out of the war, so the next step for the Russian positions in the Caucasus would be to coming back after the Caucasus to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia that we did 100 years ago. Well, if Russia gets weaker from the situation, what's happening in Ukraine, the situation is also problematic because we never seen a weak Russia. We have seen strong Russia, we've seen authoritarian Russia, but we never seen decentralized or weaker Russia. That could be a very problematic both for the reaching a peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But what can be said right now that unfortunately so far neither European Union nor United States have a strong tools of influencing the both countries to reach a peace agreement. Last week, I think the head of the Secretary of Armenian and this with an Armenian high-ranking official, and Hikmet Ajiv, assistant to the president, they met in Washington, D.C. Together with national advisor and discussed ideas of the peace agreement. This was one of the rarest events when the United States intervened and had a set kind of meetings. Presidents of Azerbaijan and Armenia had a meeting in Brussels several times. But so far, what we can say that Moscow has an extremely high influence in Karabakh and has a high influence over the abilities to distract or actually promote peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Thank you.
Perfect. The next up is Kornely Kakachia from the Georgian Institute of Politics. Georgia at the Crossroads.
Hello. As you already know, I mean, from today's discussion, there's so many changes in and around Georgia because of this unfortunate war in Ukraine, and there's so many challenges as well as in South Caucasus. And suddenly, everybody was expecting that Georgia, who was front-runner in Eastern Partnership for many years, and like kind of seeing last decade's kind of beacon of democracy, that Georgia would catch some sort of like its window of opportunity and will be kind of winner from this situation. Unfortunately, this is not the case with Georgia. So that's why my memo's name is like Georgia from Crossroads to Crossroads, because every 5 years we have Georgia is a crossroad. So and it seems that what's happening now in this country, that Georgia is losing strategic compass, unfortunately. And there's several reasons for this. One is the external, security environment, and then there's also in internal challenges. And I'll try to highlight very briefly about these two things. First of all, externally, as you know, Georgia has two occupied territories in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and of course, it impacts its like foreign policy in many ways. Also, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this window of opportunity was opened up for European integration. And as you know, the Georgian population supports a very high number of Georgian population support European integration. And there was an understanding that, Georgia has done so many things last years, and in terms of European integration, that Georgia will be probably one of the pioneers in this, in this process. As we all remember, after this, after the recent decision of European Union, Ukraine and Moldova, they were given the candidate status for EU, which was revolutionary. If somebody would ask me like 6 months ago that, that could happen, I would not believe it. But this window opportunity would just open up because of this unfortunate war. And suddenly Georgia, who again, who was a front runner, it just got a European, aspirations, and maybe even that, was not would not be bad like 6 months ago. But now most of the Georgians, especially young people, they think this is a missed opportunity, because in terms of fulfillment of association agreement with the European Union, Georgia actually exceeds Ukraine and Moldova. Georgia has done almost like 40% of its homework in terms of this technical things. But at the end of the day, we should not forget that European integration is not about just ticking these boxes about the reform, but it's about the how actually government is behaving, and also how actually Georgia is in line with its Western partners, especially with the European Union. In that matter, we had a huge problem, and we still have this problem that actually Georgian government could not manage, to cope with these relations, especially with Ukraine, and of course, it impacted also Georgia's image to EU and United States. What is more alarming, it's not about the image of Georgia, which is shattered now, but the thing is that we hear a very unprecedented, I would say, anti-Western sentiment, which never happened in Georgia. Last 30 years, we never had a government. We had a very strange government, like revolutionary, non-revolutionary, any kind of government, but none of them actually use this kind of, like wording, like basically criticizing U.S. ambassador or or EU ambassador. This is very strange for a country who actually wants to be part of the European Union. At the same time, basically with this kind of statements, you have a chance that you alienate your strategic partner. And that's a very dangerous thing, because at the end of the day, Georgia is not a member of NATO, neither member of European Union. So Georgia is only member of this collective security organization of Likuan, which is, I don't think that anybody remembers it anymore. So in that sense, Georgia is very vulnerable, and basically, I understand that there's some, I would say, arguments from Georgian side that we have to be very careful. And after 2008 war, we saw that actually when there was a war, there was nobody actually helped Georgia, and maybe that's still valid. But we should not forget that if tomorrow Putin's Russia will decide to invade Georgia, and I think there's nobody else except West who could help Georgia, and that's also argument, right? But it seems like Georgian government doesn't buy this argument. They're just trying to continue this foreign policy posture, which they started in 2012, which they're selling as a kind of like pragmatism, and basically, which means how to accommodate basically Russia's geopolitical interests. At the same time, kind of continuing European integration. There's a less and less talk about NATO integration. It's not actually, to be fair, not only the fault of Georgian government, but it also is there should be two-way like movement there. Unfortunately, there was not much done from the Western side, and I think especially Obama's administration policy and also foreign policy of Trump administration didn't help much, because basically Georgia felt neglected, and there's a more and more, I would say, reflections that people think that United States actually exited from South Caucasus already for like decades, and even though like I know that many U.S. officials, they claim otherwise, and they see that this is not true, but that's a perception, or whatever you can call it, a misperception, but this is that. And I think that in general, Georgia is in vulnerable position in many ways, and we just you probably just heard that 2 days ago, this Belarusian president actually visited Abkhazia, and actually he didn't yet recognize Abkhazia or South Ossetia, but actually he made this visit after meeting Putin. So I think it's already clear that Georgia's foreign policy, like to accommodate Russia, Belarus, all this autocratic regime, doesn't really bring any fruit so far. And we don't know what will happen in next, but things is it's clear that Georgia needs kind of a different kind of foreign policy in many ways. One of the problems also with Georgian foreign policy is that even though government is trying to sell it differently, in reality, Russia has some sort of informal veto power on because now every decision the Georgia government makes, it just look what Moscow will think. That's why we called in another memo, which we published in PONARS 3 months ago, Finlandization of Georgian foreign policy. And together with my colleague, I'm working now for research paper, actually, which should be published in academic journals. I think this is also true because it seems like one of the reasons of this is not only about the wish of the political elite, but it also has an internal causes of this. One of the major problem of this is that ruling party Georgian Dream, which is now on third term in Georgia, which is very extraordinary. None of the government managed to do this before. And basically now they are in very shaky position because their popularity is declining. But it doesn't mean that like opposition is doing well. Opposition is also very fragmented, and that's put and plus Georgian political scene is very much polarized. Even this polarization, whatever we call it, it's not really classical polarization like we have in the West. It's not based on ideologies or like in European states or in the United States. It's basically very personally driven. Like Saakashvili versus Ivanishvili. And even that one we have a fate, right? And I think this puts country in very awkward situation. Plus, there is also some sort of, I would say, current authorities. They also really afraid of the losing the power, and they're trying to clinch the power. And I think that is one of the reasons also this kind of foreign policy. To say frankly, they are so much afraid of this losing power, and they're not actually ready to either share power with the opposition or just lose the power, because at the end of the day, it's about the personal security of their oligarch actually, who was the founder of Georgian Dream, and also it's about the survival of the regime, because as you know, if you look to Georgian history last 30 years. This change of government, the regime change was always reflected, and there was some sort of unwritten rule of Georgian politics. Then there was some sort of vendetta for against previous government. So if you look to Georgian history, like what they did, for instance, what Gamsakhurdia did with foreign communists, and what Shevardnadze did with Gamsakhurdia, and then Saakashvili with Shevardnadze, and now you see what they have done with Saakashvili. So it's clear that new regime will come. They probably will continue this, and I think we need to change this game. And I know this is about political culture. It's not going to happen overnight, but if there will not be such a change, I think it will be very difficult to speak about the consolidation of Georgian democracy, which is actually tracking now and in very bad position. I think there's some sort of rule, for Western friends of Georgia, including the United States. Basically, we don't know what will be the result of this parliamentary election next 2 years. But basically, Western partners of Georgia, they should be ready to interfere if there will be major political crisis, like they did it during after the revolution, when actually James Baker came to Tbilisi, and he actually mediated, agreement between Shevardnadze and Saakashvili. And I think this kind of scenario is not excluded. So basically, there should be some sort of thinking in the Western part of in the West, how to avoid another major crisis in Georgia. Maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Panelists. Now, to help us think about this, I'll turn to Mary Glantz, who's the senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading these memos in preparation for the panel, and I think that they offered us all in their speaking here today a really good overview of the Caucasus and even sort of the context from Russia that outlines what's going on in the Caucasus today, what impact the Ukraine war is having on the Caucasus. Alexander Iskandaryan really began that well with his paper, which took a bird's eye view at, well, his paper actually looked at the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine on the former Soviet states, but he added on here for his presentation a very useful sort of assessment of why. What's going on in Russia? Is this a Putin problem or a Russia problem? How are they seeing things? Why is there war in Ukraine? And why might that have an impact on the Caucasus? What's the view from Moscow? I thought that was a really useful, helpful way to begin this presentation and sort of set the stage for all of us on what impact the war in Ukraine is having on the Caucasus. In his paper and in his presentation, he also highlighted the differences that are taking place in the countries of both the Western former Soviet Union, that's Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, and in the South Caucasus. And the Western states, he argues, are stuck in this struggle between Europe and Russia. Moldova is sort of up in the air, especially since developments on the battlefield are really going to have an impact on what happens with Moldova. Well, Belarus is stuck with Russia. It's pretty clear Belarus, as long as Lukashenko, and he makes that point very clearly, as long as Lukashenko is the president of Belarus, Belarus is stuck with Russia. They don't have a choice. The South Caucasus are at the mercy of regional players. And this he stressed very clearly and effectively, I think, and talked about how the fact that they're stuck between these three former empires that all have a great interest in the region, how that really has an impact on how these three countries are responding to the war in Ukraine. Georgia's sort of cautious. Armenia needs to avoid a fallout with Russia because of NK. And he mentions in his paper, he didn't really mention that in his presentation, but he mentions in his paper something I think that's important, and that is that Azerbaijan is testing Russia in Nagorno-Karabakh. And we saw that last week, 2 weeks ago. Recently, we saw that Azerbaijan is really testing Russian resolve to maintain a stabilizing influence in the region. Anar Valiyev then talked about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and how it presents challenges, how it's affected by the war in Ukraine, and how what's happened with the conflict and with the war in Ukraine has presented challenges and opportunities for Baku. Now, in his presentation, his oral presentation, he really focused on the challenges, which I thought was an interesting approach. It's most of the people I've seen talking in media and analytics circles and from think tanks have focused on the opportunities that this presents to Azerbaijan. And as we saw with Russia testing, or Azerbaijan testing Russia in Nagorno-Karabakh, that's been the focus of most presentations. But he talks about the challenges, how Azerbaijan is going to have to deal with whether Russia emerges stronger, but particularly if Russia emerges weaker from this war with Ukraine. That's going to lead to some instability and uncertainty in the South Caucasus. What role will Russia play in the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and how will Azerbaijan respond to that? So I think he raised some very interesting questions there that I at least hadn't really thought about before. In addition, in his paper, and I advise you all to look at it because he also talks about the opportunities. And instead of the opportunity of just seizing Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the obvious one that leaves out to most of us, he talks about opportunities with energy trade with the EU, shipping Azerbaijani gas to the EU to make up for that lack of gas they're going to get from Russia, and also the opportunity to serve as a natural transit point for Kazakh crude oil. Sufian and Zhemukhov took us even narrower into the South Caucasus, looking at the separatist regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And I really enjoyed his presentation because as somebody who's worked on Russia a lot in the past and at the State Department, we tend to sort of lump regions together. And I always thought of it as just sort of South, we start with frozen conflicts and then we sort of say, okay, well, there are some that are less frozen than others. And then in Georgia, you have South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and it's sort of treated as if they're the same. But you really made clear the differences and how significant those differences are, or at least those differences exist and need to be looked at. The impression I got from his paper and his presentation is that the overall impact is that Russia is sort of, at least for the time being, slightly loosened its grip on the two regions, allowing a little bit more autonomy. He also contrasted what's happening in those regions with what's happening in Ukraine. And I think that's a very interesting contribution to this discussion, because we can sort of look at Ukraine as a roadmap and look at the differences in the South Caucasus with South Ossetia and Abkhazia and see how Russia adapts and what that might mean elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. I thought that the differences between Sukhumi and Tsinvali were very, they were very interesting to me in that Sukhumi was much less Sukhumi demonstrated support and enthusiasm, its pro-Russian position, but with much less enthusiasm than Senvali was my impression, my takeaway from that. South Ossetia had that aborted call for a referendum annexation, and Abkhazia was sort of, no, we really want to be independent. So I thought that was interesting. Kornely Kakachia discussed then Georgia writ large. And I thought what was really interesting about his paper and his presentation was looking at the impact on domestic politics in Georgia of this war in Ukraine. When I think of the South Caucasus, and I'm sure this is the same for a lot of people, and I think about the war against Ukraine, I think about the impact on this frozen conflicts, but he also talks about the impact on Georgia as a whole. And I thought that was a really interesting take, looking at both the foreign policy and security implications of the war, and the domestic political implications. It was an interesting point that Georgia is now more vulnerable to Russian threats, including hybrid. He focused on some risks and threats towards Georgia that I hadn't really given a lot of deep thought to. When I had sort of looked at it, I thought, oh, is Russia having pulled these troops out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia? Is that an opportunity for Georgia to try to take that territory back with Russia distracted? But highlighting these other threats and challenges that this presents to Georgia, I think is a really useful and important contribution. He also notes that this conflict, this Russian change in foreign policy, or this Russian expansion of foreign policy, adds another layer of conflict to Georgia's radicalized domestic political dynamics. So overall, I thought that this panel gave us a really good take on what's going on in the region, both from the bird's eye view, from Moscow's view, and down to the grassroots, looking at some local political context. The main takeaways I got from all of these presentations and papers were that what's going on with Russia and Ukraine is creating a lot of uncertainty in the South Caucasus, that all of the states in the region are having to be cautious to some extent and are watching the outcome of the war, because it will affect their ability to maneuver and their ability to operate, not just with each other, not just with the West, but not just with Russia, but also in their domestic internal political context. So I thought that was really interesting, that there are increased risks for these countries, and that there are some increased opportunities perhaps as well. And the main takeaway I got was that this is a period of instability that it would really behoove the United States and Europe to watch more closely and perhaps become more actively involved in. And so that's, I want to thank them all for their great papers for cheating on it. Give all of us a lot of good food for thought.
I think you may be a way to start off the conversation. So now I'd like to open the floor to identify yourself and ask a question. Start with Daniel's hand. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks for conversation and papers. The question really for the whole panel, Alexander kind of hinted at this to a certain extent, but interested in other sorts of actors, right? So actors from outside the region, particularly, are you seeing anything basically changing since the war began in terms of the behavior of China, the US, the European Union in the region, but also transnational criminal actors and illicit actors in the region? Anything?
Why don't we go ahead and answer the question since we have a lot of time? So,
Oh, okay. Now, you have other actors, not just generally the war. I mean, 2020 Second Karabakh War shows that if you look at not domestic but internal actors, that just two of them came to the region strategically. I mean, two regional powers, Turkey and Russia. That's it. If you ask me about others, Europeans, Americans, they are part of reality, but they use usually diplomatic and political instruments, which is not enough for stabilizing of the situation. It's ongoing process. Even now, just several days ago, Nancy Pelosi with three other congressmen and women that were in Armenia. You have contacts between America's elite, I mean, Armenians. You have contacts with Russians. You have so-called Brussels process negotiations, which is organized by Brussels, etc. But I repeat, it is not enough for stabilizing the situation. Everybody are busy. You know. South Caucasus is not the center of thinking of Europeans, Americans, or I don't know. So you fill in the regional powers. Sure, you have China's actor, you have Japan, you have Arabic countries, etc. But it is not enough. That's why situation is so, I would say, complicated. Okay. You.
Just to add a few things about the outside actors. I think that there's an increasing feeling in the region, especially for Georgian perspective, that Georgia is surrounded by illiberal powers, because even Turkey now, who actually was considered to be like a candidate country for the EU, and that was the image of Turkey in Georgia is changing really. So, and there's even a question: can Georgia, as an emerging democracy, can be consolidated democracy in such a geopolitical environment when you have autocratic, like neighborhood, and you have actually anti-autocratic pressure even from these countries. So, and this valid question. About China, I think that China also tries to invest and in the region, but I think there's increasingly more in this involvement, especially in Georgia, of China. And don't forget that Georgia has a free trade agreement with the European Union and China, so that's very unique for a small country like Georgia. But I think it seems like the more Georgia will move towards the European Union, there will be more tension between Georgia and China, because of tension between West and China. As far as the European Union, I think there's a huge change now from EU, that they now finally understood after this war that for instance, the European leaders now highlighted that they see Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as the future members of the European Union. That was never spelled out before. So I think this is a revolutionary change, and probably this is, if Georgia will do its homework and something, this can open up some opportunities for other countries of Eastern Partnership. Neighbor.
For going outside the powers, I would say that China China's influence was successfully killed after the COVID, because before the COVID, China was very active in the Caucasus, especially in Azerbaijan, coming with investment. But the COVID completely, not destroyed, but just to simply push off the Chinese plan, especially with the transportation lines and so on. But what's really interesting, what's happening in Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia, is actually a replication of another struggle that happened between Pakistan and India. So Pakistan is always, Azerbaijan is always supported by Pakistan, especially during the war and after the war, before the war. And there's everywhere where we've seen that there's Pakistan support over Azerbaijan, that automatically made India not pro-Azerbaijani and technically pro-Armenian from that perspective. So what we see right now in the Caucasus, that the two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, is competing on this territory, while Azerbaijan supported by Pakistan, while Armenia supported by technically India from this perspective. So these two powers, I think, will be a certain type of, not struggle, but at least you will see certain type of the contradictions or confrontations between the two powers, especially in our region.
Well, also at the specifically about South Ossetia and Abkhazia that I focused on, we can see that in case of EU and United States, they remain stable in their position, which was actually remarkable, seeing how Georgia was ambivalent and sometimes even pro-Russian, some segments of Georgian political landscape. Also, everybody else probably shifted a little bit when Russia actually showed reluctance to annex South Ossetia, and also Kornely mentioned recent visit of Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, to Abkhazia, and that kind of echoes a proposal that Abkhazia made instead of joining Russia to join a united union state between Belarus and Russia. If that will actually happen, we'll see. But Lukashenko's visit was kind of response to that.
Okay. Sorry, here.
Thank you very much. My name is Nadik Sefigan. I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Valiyev, I would be very happy to hear commentary from you on two phenomena. One is the rationale in the recent violence that took place on the borders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, not Karabakh. I wonder what the thinking is behind that. And secondly, just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Azerbaijan and Russia signed a very comprehensive alliance agreement of some sort. I wonder if you could also comment on that and how that has changed in the last months. Thank you.
I will collect a couple of questions. So yes, back there. If you could bring the microphone over to.
I'm Zachary Turinsky, and I'm studying at American University. And I was in the Caucasus last month, and one thing that struck me was that in Azerbaijan, every time I saw the Azerbaijani flag, it was with the Turkish flag. Every time I saw the Georgian flag, it was with the EU flag. And in Armenia, the Armenian flag every time was alone. There wasn't, there was no Russian flag next to it. So my question is, where do you see the long-term future for Armenia? Because it seems to me Georgia and Azerbaijan, their long-term geopolitical orientations are somewhat clear, but with Armenia, in the long term, do you see it having a strong connection with Russia, the United States, Iran, or no?
Okay, so why don't we answer those two questions all? I don't know who wants to start. No.
In the Caucasus, we usually will give the older person to just give it.
Okay. Nothing personal.
Nothing
personal.
Okay. Oh, yes, right. I've been in Azerbaijan last time 22 years ago. I cannot go there because they have a law or something which is ethnic, not even citizenship. You can not go to Azerbaijan if you are American or Ukrainian or I don't know Greek or Russian or Argentinian with a surname with young in the end. So I cannot. I haven't seen flags there in Georgia. Yes, maybe hundreds of times. In Armenia, you see that no, you cannot see Russian flag because in identity of Armenians, you can have a country which you have good, brilliant relationships with. For example, Iran, very good relations with Iran, both economic. But you cannot feel yourself Iranian as Georgian can feel himself or herself European, or as Armenian can feel himself or herself European. So as for future, good question. We'll wait till Ukrainian war will finish or will not. Then we'll see. If you would ask me a perspective, what is going to be in Turkey after Erdogan and in Russia after Putin, I will say I don't know. Just I don't know. I know that Russia, Iran, Turkey will continue to play a role in the region just because they are huge and they are our neighbor. That's it. I don't have another Turkey for you, I don't have another Russian for you, I don't have another Iran with you, we live where we live. So South Caucasus still is not a region. It's divided, you know, you can, sometimes they say in the way that you are neighbors. No, we're neighbors just on the map. I have no problem to go to, I don't know, Australia. I just buy a ticket. I cannot go to Baku. It's impossible. Just impossible. So you need to construct a region. This region should be constructed with neighbors. Are they good or bad? Or Russia will be included in this balance, regional balance. Europe will be in, if Europe will exist in let's say 20 years or 30 years as a body, as a structure. So I don't know. For going to future, you should understand that at least in Armenia, you cannot do the choice which is going to be forever. You'll do your choices every day on the reality you have around the world. Geography matters. And you can see in Armenia how situation is changing with all these changes now, and in Azerbaijan, Georgia, etc. So we'll see. Now the goal is, if you look at discussions in Armenia, the goal is to survive, and then we'll see how it's going to develop around us and inside South Caucasus. So I would say like that.
Okay, thank you. I following Alexander's kind of the surnames. Yeah, I remember Sufian was actually coming to Baku a couple of years ago, right? And because of Sufian, the custom officer didn't know whether this guy is Armenian or something like that. So it's, at the end, they find out it's actually Sufian, it's an Arabic name, it's not Armenian. So
It was a name of mayor of Jena in time of Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, fantastic. But the ending was young, that's why it was not. Okay, so back in July 2021, Azerbaijan signed comprehensive political agreement with Turkey. So that was a political, military, economic, so-called Shusha declaration that made Azerbaijan so close to the Turkey. And that's the moment when the analysts start to say, okay, Russians will never forget about that. They will want the same type of the declaration between Russia and Azerbaijan. And everybody was expecting that such kind of things happen. And technically what they signed, it's actually accommodation of everything that was signed before. There was nothing new. But the fact that it was exactly 2 days before the invasion, that made the thing that it actually was kind of the Russian intentions to show, well, okay, before the invasion, I want this, who is with me and who is against me, or something like that. And that's why from Azerbaijan perspective, that was a typical diplomatic lip services. Okay, Russians want to do this, let's go and sign it. But that's what somehow counterbalancing what Azerbaijan signed with Turkey back in July 2021. As for the recent clashes, again, if we talk from perspective of Azerbaijani government, they simply say that this is the clashes because the border is not delimited, it's not demarked or something like that. From perspective of Armenia, it's simply, Azerbaijan is pushing hard. It's Azerbaijan started these clashes in order to push Armenia for the peace agreement, to sign the peace agreement finally, because Azerbaijan is in rush from that perspective. Because of that, Baku wants to sign a peace agreement within a very short period of time, within 6 or 7 months, and that's why using all possible measures in order to force Armenian so-called coercive diplomacy to bring Armenia to the table finally to sign the agreement, because nobody knows what's going to happen in summer 2023. Everyone may be gone, situation may change, tide will change. So right now, Baku is using every power, every moment to bring Armenians to the table to sign a peace agreement. That's what.
Just to add what was said here, that actually Georgia's case is very interesting. Now, together with my colleague, we're writing academic paper about Georgia as a misplaced state, and I think that's a really interesting case because we don't have so many countries there, and because for like almost like 10 years or even a decade, Georgia was trying to kind of escape from the South Caucasus, like politically. And as you know, geographically that's not possible. And it is still a region, historically, economically, but politically it's a failed region, right? But now it seems like after this European, this candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova, I think that Georgia is really managed political elites. You can criticize them whatever they want, but it seems like they managed to somehow to clinch to Ukraine. And so within this Black Sea security and with the Black Sea identity to this, I think this puts Georgia even now a little bit farther with our immediate neighbors like Armenia and Azerbaijan. Plus, there's also this so-called initiative of by Turkey and Russia of 3+3 is also doesn't really fit very well to Georgia. This is basically kind of the liberal international basically offer to Georgia, which doesn't include Georgia's strategic partners, the United States or European Union. That's absolutely non-starter for Georgia. And I think in that sense, Georgia is now, Georgia is not alone. There's a lot of countries like Chile, Japan, some others with the Islamic states, who are trying to escape from geography. And I think that Georgia is actually trying to manage that. And it seems like after the decision of the European Union with European perspective, I think it's kind of succeeding. But probably we will work on this, and you'll probably see some article on that.
Okay, we have one question. So here's the microphone.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the panelists and discussants. And I have two questions, two small questions to Sufian and to Anar and probably to the others. Sufian, the question is, when you showed the slide, you called it status quo. What did you mean? Because I think what you described is very far from the status quo. So does it mean that you are not kind of expecting the new developments in the region? So in this territorial entities. So because the status quo for me is probably something very different, but just to know. And Anar, I congratulate you. I think it was fantastic what you say. For me, it was probably the most important thing that I started to immediately think through. And this was about what you said. We never saw weak Russia. Do you remember you said this? We never saw weak Russia. So all the calculation goes that Russia was strong. So whatever it means, but it is strong. So my small question to you is, but we had weak Russia back in 90s, okay, and there is those in the political class who still remember how it was. Do you think this remembrance are not important, or this will be a different weakness? And for Kornely and for Alexander, probably to Sufian. So what are you thinking about the weak Russia? Do you know how to deal with the weak Russia? So a weak Russia, weak, decentralized, disorganized, because this will be probably something very, very new. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that's a big question, so I don't know if you guys want to.
Well, thank you very much for the question. So to clarify, I was comparing situation before the formal just election and after. So I kind of really call it old status quo, and this referendum and elections have made different actors express new positions sometimes or reaffirm those positions. And now we kind of know where they stand at this moment. But you're absolutely right. Tomorrow, somebody may announce another referendum or another annexation. So it's very shifting. But that's what I meant by status quo. As for weak Russia, we actually have historical evidence of how weak Russia affects the region after the World War I, how different actors in South Caucasus and in North Caucasus reacted, how actually three South Caucasus republics were able to form one Trans-Caucasus Republic, and before that, how democratic governments were elected in those republics, and the same way in the North Caucasus, the North Caucasus republics joined into Mountaineer Republic and confronted Bolsheviks and then had to escape the country. So that's one historical example when the South Caucasus and North Caucasus political forces were able to unite. And we have something completely opposite in 1991, when actually the many of separatist and second wave separatist movements started in South Caucasus and North Caucasus, particularly in Nagorno-Karabakh, and between North Ossetia and Ossetia, those were practically one of very first conflicts in the region. And since then, we could see that weak Russia after 1991 produced a very unstable situation both in North Caucasus and South Caucasus. So we'll see next time if this will be early 20th century or late 20th century situation. But there are so many unresolved land issues in both North and South Caucasus that we can most certainly predict that weak Russia will use another wave of conflicts both in North and South Caucasus.
Do we have the microphone to our young colleague now? Different about you.
This is not Caucasus, this is Washington.
Well, I still believe that 1990s Russia wasn't so weak as we expected. So the 1992 to 2000 before Putin came to the power. So we saw that the situation in Russia was not so kind of centralized. There was a lot of problems, Chechnya issues, Dagestan problems, and so on. But yet there was a certain type of the institutions that kept Russia strong, at least between the 90s. So whenever we talk about 1990s, it's a period of chaos, but it's not a weak Russia. That Russia was not weak in 1990s. And the fear is that if at some point this decentralization efforts or decentralization happen in Russia, it will be avalanche type of the destructions of all institutions and everything. And that will have a spillover effect from the North Caucasus to the South Caucasus, especially taking into consideration that Dagestan is another hotbed of the future radicalization or future disenchantment, and the poverty and employment. That this, the moment that Russia getting weaker, the Northern Caucasus will get
I kind of agree with Anar, because there's also differences in Georgia. It depends who are you asking about this weak Russia. If you ask the former political elites, I think we had done some study a few years ago where basically we interviewed people from former Saakashvili's elite and the Georgian Dream elite, and we interviewed 20 people from each camp, and it was clear that they have a different vision about Russia. For instance, for Saakashvili's elite, Russia is a kind of number one threat, and which needs to be countered, and like it's an existential threat. While for Georgian Dream, it's I think they are more cautious. They don't think, and their policy also toward Northern Caucasus actually different. For instance, Saakashvili was supporting actually government to have more contacts with Northern Caucasus to kind of how to say stimulate there some sort of national independence movement, and that's how that can cease, like liberating North Caucasus, and there should be something buffer whatever left over from Russia. When Georgian Dream actually is afraid of that, and they actually did with more the Anar mentioned more like risk, because nobody really knows what would happen with this Northern Caucasus after Russia leaves there. So that's why Georgia wants as soon as possible to get some sort of integration plan to EU or NATO or something before that happens, actually, to have a sort of stability there.
Two things. First, generally, I agree with with Anar. Russia was weak in early 90s, but maybe you don't mean it, maybe it wasn't so weak as you can expect. All of us, all South Caucasus had a lot of problems in South Caucasus at that time. Or, for example, economic crisis in Armenia and blockade in Armenia was connected more with Abkhazian crisis than with Karabakh. The energy gas pipeline was and is now goes through Ingushetia, Georgia and Armenia, and it was explored more than 40 times that time, which was a, you can imagine the situation in Armenia at that time. Destabilization in Northern Caucasus, which was a case that time, not just eastern part of Northern Caucasus, but western part, Circassian part of Northern Caucasus was a problem for South Caucasus as well, mainly Georgia. But second, what I'm going to say, I wouldn't, just extrapolate that experience to now. Generally speaking, I would say I don't know, and what especially I don't know, I'm not sure that strong Russia is more dangerous for not just us but South Caucasus as well than weak Russia. Maybe weak Russia would be a problem as well, because in this type of decision making, you can weigh very different types of decisions from withdrawal of Russians from South Caucasus to vice versa process. So it's a problem, and maybe weak Russia is more a problem than strong Russia.
Okay, we have time for more questions, I guess.
Yes, so I'm Anar.
Would you mind waiting for that? And then please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? All right, so I'm Anna Lejava. I'm also from Georgia. Thanks for Kornely being here and representing Georgia so well. I am a master's student at Georgetown's Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies program. So my question, I have a few. My first question is related to the idea of Georgia being kind of stuck in this geographic limitations that we have. We mentioned the Black Sea Security Act that Senator Shaheen introduced in July. I wonder what your opinion is on its actual potential and how Georgia can leverage that act to not only attach itself to the security framework, but also potentially develop economically. And I'm relating to the Anaklia deep sea port. Can that be somehow included into this security framework? And my second question is to Dr. Valiyev. What role, and for the longest time, Georgia has been kind of this like a middle brother between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What real practical role can Georgia play? We know that there was an attempt in the Minsk to negotiate and be that kind of negotiating platform. What Georgia can do more to help Azerbaijan and Armenia kind of amend their differences, big differences? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we get one more question back here?
Thank you very much. My name is Mikhail Pirbuda again. I study with Anna at Georgetown University, Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. I had a question to Dr. Valiyev, and you mentioned before the war in Ukraine, you mentioned that prior to the escalation and to the actual invasion, Armenia and Azerbaijan were approaching or moving towards reconciliation. I think you used that word. Could you talk about that a little bit more? Because it sounds like a very alternative viewpoint. And also the panelists mentioned the sort of window of opportunity for the United States or Europe to be more attentive to the region. And we talked about Europe, we talked about the European Union. And also there was a mention of Nancy Pelosi coming to Armenia with a visit. I'm curious to see or to hear your opinion on how eager will the United States be to enter the region, be more active there if Russia remains or even accelerates its reserved attitude or withdraws further. Thank you.
Okay, that's setting the table for a lot of good questions. So why don't we start with Cornely this time?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think this, we actually did this last week. We wrote together with Anar and with some other Ukrainian colleagues paper about legacy security, basically discussing the elite opinions about Georgia, how the war in Ukraine actually affected the security in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Ukraine. And this is on, I think, PONARS also shared this with on Twitter. I think that the legacy security really matters for Georgia now, even more after this war. Again, as I said, we don't know what will be the result of this war, but one thing is clear that Georgia really need to be very proactive. And it's not only Georgia, because Georgia cannot do this alone, but now this legacy security is issue of not only for Georgia, Ukraine, all these legacy neutral states or wider legacy, but this has also become part of European security. So this means that like this region should be elevated a little bit more. There should be more attention. And I remember 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion in US, different universities, like involving talking about the wider basic security. But now I think in EU and only this exception is now the US paid a little bit of attention that all this literature, even academic literature which we have about basic security is outdated. And there's new changes in the region, and I think there's this is the right time to study the region and actually to talk about this more. And I would even urge PONARS maybe to have a little bit more attention. I hope, inshallah, this war will be over very soon, and we should discuss this the issue because I think this is important for everybody, United States, from European Union. I think also another issue which is very important for this Brexit, and it also I want to bring this Anarchy is the connectivity. Connectivity is very important for a country like Georgia because the Georgia moving to the European Union, it's not only for Georgia, it's a whole region for Caucasus as well as like Central Asia, because now because of this war, all this cargo now which was going through Russia now directly through Georgia, through Azerbaijan, and I think that it means that. And since we know that there will not be probably like good relations between West and Russia soon, so Western actors, especially European Union, they need to think about this connectivity. And connectivity is not as well about physical connectivity because that's also matters, but it's also energy and some other like investments. And for instance, Georgia is now doing not really well with the European Union, even though we have a free trade agreement. And one of the problems is there that we don't have a direct border, unlike, for instance, Moldova or Ukraine. And that's a huge problem. And I think now this is high time to think about this in European capitals and especially in Brussels.
Well, I would say that the Georgian role for many years was somehow to bring Armenians and Bulgarians together into the EC, and because Georgia was a really great platform place for meeting, especially NGO people from Azerbaijan and Armenia, from Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. But so far, I don't see that Georgia, Georgia, first of all, it has so many its own problems that it doesn't have any time to just deal with all the problems from that. But I think that there is some kind of the windows of opportunities when Georgia can mediate between Azerbaijan and Armenia, especially in the cases of the ending hostilities or returning those people whom Armenia considered prisoners of war, Azerbaijan considered the saboteurs or something like that. There was some kind of cases. So the Georgia can become I would say that good mediator, but without irritating Russians. So that's we have to just find a very nice formula so Georgians are kind of there, but not without kind of intervening with Russia to consider themselves as what it is they own. As for the reconciliations, I think that what's really happened after the Karabakh War, Second Karabakh War, there was a certain signal from Azerbaijani government that go ahead and communicate with Armenians. Go ahead and cooperate with Armenians as much as you can. What does it mean that if before the war, Azerbaijani government position was we don't cooperate with Armenians, we don't communicate with them because they occupy our territories. Right after the conflict, they simply said Armenians are not occupying our territories anymore. There's no obstacles for cooperating with Armenians. So that was the kind of the green light for many projects, whether it's different platforms or bringing together Armenian, Azerbaijani political scientists, Jewish people, civil society, or governmental officials. So I see that, and even right now, until recent escalation, until September escalation, there was several tracks of the bringing Armenians and Azerbaijanis people together. As for the US role in the Caucasus, so the biggest fear right now, I would say especially in Baku, is that to not internationalize Karabakh conflict. So once the moment the Karabakh conflict become internationalized, forget about resolution of the Karabakh. So once the Russians believe that Americans are here or Europeans are here and they're trying to reach over here or something, the Russians are okay with the Turkish influence, but they're not okay with Americans or Europeans. Azerbaijan in this situation is stuck. So what to do? So the fear of internationalization immediately will mean that Russia will behave completely different. So that's about the biggest fear of Azerbaijan, to not internationalize the conflict. Let's keep the conflict as a domestic situation of Azerbaijan. And I think that's it. What's the question?
No, not about this was. You know what Kornely said about Georgia, it's the same about Armenia. I mean, a difference between mental map and geographical map. If you would read Armenian newspapers or TV or I don't know, sites, etc., on foreign policy, it's like paranoia. You will realize that Armenia is somewhere in Atlantic Ocean between Washington, Brussels, and I don't know, St. Petersburg. Psychologically, Brussels is closer than Mosul. Who knows about Mosul? Who cares about Erbil? What you know about Tabriz? What you think about Erzurum? In 2020, the war, the Second Karabakh War, shows us, I mean, Armenia, that you are here. You are not just in post-Soviet space, which was part of mental map as well. Well, I think that Vladivostok is closer than Baghdad. But Syrian border is northern border of Syria. So the region where ISIS was acting several years ago is 300 kilometers from 20 miles from the border of my country. So you realize where you are really. And now it's changing. I wouldn't call it status quo because it's enemy. You have a status quo, but you still don't have something new status quo. You live in situation when you try to compare this mental map where you are choosing between I don't know, Lithuanian way or Portuguese way. Are you going to be a member of this bloc, European Union or Eurasian Union or something? But not you are not just in post-Soviet space, you are in Greater Middle East. You have an acre or you don't have an acre, you are there. So this changing understanding of the region, coming this new I would say point of view to understand where you are, is bringing to changes. But I don't think that you can have such kind of changing in one night or 1 month or 1 year or maybe one generation. It's a long term, long time to understand where you are really. So it is, I would say it's for all Caucasus, not just Caucasus, post-Soviet space, etc. And it is very important to understand where you are where you are in reality, because geography is still.
Okay, well, we have just a few more minutes, so why don't we collect all the last questions and we'll give the speaker time to answer.
You just answered the question I was going to ask. So I kind of liked Ray Taylor from Quaker from Oxford, UK. So quite interested in what Mary has to say about any of this from the US Institute of Peace perspective. With the Montreal Protocol and the Kigali revision, we saw that a long-term vision of where we want to get to can sometimes help with the shorter term, and things actually go faster. Even the countries that didn't have to make the early changes, they saw, okay, if we're all going there, we'll go there quicker. And I noticed that in times when there isn't a war involving Russia, the people who have idealistic new peace plans for Europe and OSCE and NATO, we don't need you. But now everybody needs some kind of exit strategy, even if it's for 2030, 2050, 2080. And I thought that, oh, Georgia could be in that too. But now as I listen to you, I see it's much more complicated than that. But I wonder if any of you have a longer term vision or hope or dream that could give diplomats and others a little bit of hope at this time, because that would be very useful.
That's a great question. Is there any
It
other?
might be a good last question.
Yes. Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. Patrick Ambrojo, Harriman Institute, Columbia University. I'll direct this question to Alexander, but I'd like to open it up to everybody, but particularly Alexander, because I think you touched upon this in your previous response. And that's this designation, this use of the term post-Soviet space. Perhaps you can speak specifically to the South Caucasus, but I would even expand it beyond into broader Eurasia. Is this a term that is becoming obsolete? Not just simply because we are 30 odd years beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also does it impose a certain epistemological restriction that is not useful analytically? So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And
Thank you.
there's one more question.
Thank you very much for the panel. It's always a pleasure to see Caucasian scholars come together. Please do it more often. My question comes back to this discourse on external actors in the South Caucasian neighborhood, not region, specifically Turkey and Iran. What role do you think they could play in the Azeri-Armenian peace, especially with whispers of pan-Turkism and with Iran's support of Armenia? Ironic considering its high concentration of Azeris, but it is what it is. And in light of a Russia that may emerge weakened from the war and the stability or instability that will follow as a result. Thank you.
All right, so we have questions about visions for the future, peace. So you each have 2 minutes to wrap up, and maybe Mary, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about peace or anything. Okay, Conelly?
I'll start the question with Dream because we have a ruling party, it's called Georgian Dream. So we have about the region, I think there's a basically whatever you call this region, neighborhood, whatever, this is influx. Now we don't know what to call, and I agree with the comments that you cannot call it post-Soviet space anymore because this is already integrated. And you cannot call it even, I don't know, Eastern Partnership, because we don't know after this, actual decision of the European Union now, there's a lot of discussion what to do with this Eastern Partnership. At some point, EU wants to keep it, like even though, Belarus is not there, Azerbaijan is kind of technically there, but in reality, no. And then basically there's only Armenia, and the 3 other countries, they are not so much interested. So what to call this region? Okay, this was a gray zone for some time, but now after this war, it will be clear where this region belongs probably. But in terms of, like what to call this region, there's a different version. I don't know, some call it like, like New Eastern Europe or whatever. At least Georgians won't say that. That's how they see it. But I think as far as the, like dreams, I think clear that I think that each country, they have their specific interest, geopolitical, and the future, they see it's a little bit diverse. And that's why I think we should not really force anybody, and that was always my line when we talk with the Caucasus, that everybody should respect their own, like strategic choice. Whatever the choice is, that main point is that there should not be, this strategic choice should not be obstacle for bilateral relations or regional approach. I think that's the main thing. If we can manage that, that probably will be. And then after 10 years, we will see maybe Armenia will change something, or I don't know, Azerbaijan change, or Georgia changes or something. But I think that's what we need. There was also a question about, there was one was Soviet, and there was something, and Dreaming. There was some, I think in general, I think there's a need for international actors, especially from European Union, United States, to have a little bit more engagement in this, whatever we call it, post-Soviet space or whatever, because it seems like after this war, there will be a lot of changes there. It's not only geopolitical changes, but mental changes, like economic, social, all this kind of thing. And I think there's a really more need to involve there, of the outside actors, and also there's a competition. It's already clear that West doesn't want, for instance, to see the more involvement from China in this region. So, and and I think in general, we probably need to have a little bit new approaches to the region, whatever will be there.
Thank you very much.
Well, one question about Iran and Turkey. I would say that both of the countries have a mistrust of one of the countries of the region. So, for example, Azerbaijan see Turkish role as a very good kind of from positive side, and really hope that opening borders between Armenia and Turkey would somehow bring together Azerbaijan and Armenia with reconciliation efforts. But Turkey has a high mistrust of Armenian society of Armenia. Meanwhile, Iran is a highly mistrust of Azerbaijan. So because Azerbaijan looks at Iranians, Iranian foreign policy and Iran as a state, as if not friendly, it's not enemy, but I would say mostly not friendly type of the state, because every 5 or 6 months you see that Iranian statements going against Azerbaijan, certain type of the Ayatollahs coming out with a certain type of fetvas against our certain type of the policies, or so on and so forth. So both countries have problems with the trust of each society. But even if you go to outside to Russia, Russia also has mistrust from both of them. The only kind of the union, I would say, the only European Union somehow, or maybe United States somehow has a certain type of equal level of trust and mistrust from Armenian and Azerbaijani society that can do. But Turkey and Iran, I mean, although each of them has a huge potential to influence, but they both have their problems with each country.
Okay, dreams and nation. As for dreams, I don't have dreams. At least as an analytic, maybe in my private life I do. But as an analyst, you can see that Great Britain of 17th century looks more than modern Afghanistan than modern Great Britain. So it is possible to build a region, because region is what we call a region. And you can construct this region. For that, you should not just resolve Karabakh conflict or Abkhazian conflict or South Ossetia or whatever. You need to change people. You need to go from 18th century to 21st, second, and change societies. And if you'll do it, you will have future. If you will survive. Not you will. As for nation, I'm sorry. I need a couple of hours at least for that. I don't think that post-Soviet space like it exists as something common. So I don't think that the nation is same thing in Belarus and in Armenia. It's different in different places. places. For Caucasus, for my country, for example, it is very typical that we have problems. For example, we have problems with political identity. But you have strong cultural, ethnic, religious, linguistic, etc. You in Ukraine, it might be different. A person for, let's say, Donetsk, he or she can have self-determination as Ukrainian or as Russian, or as I don't know, Donbass, and he or she will continue to live here. It's absolutely impossible in South Caucasus because background of nation building is ethnic. The difference between Armenian and Azerbaijan is so clear for people. It's not about politics, it's about identity. You cannot decide that tomorrow you're going to be Azerbaijani, being a person with Yan at the end of your name, like Sufian. So the ethnic, the background of nation building is still ethnic. It is changing somehow, but you need time, and not just time. You need to work on that. It's about education. It's about media. It's about discourses. It's about conferences, etc., to change this. I stop here because I can talk hours and hours.
Well, I'd like to tie this question, great question. So in the current political landscape in the South Caucasus, we can see that it's practically impossible to see any long-term strategy, and two ongoing conflicts there between Armenia and Azerbaijan on one hand, and Georgian involvement in Ukrainian conflict, ambivalence about it, showed that there's not much to do there. The United States had to stay away because of the political landscape domestic in Georgia, and with Turkey becoming more prominent in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that's still the United States has hoped to have more influence in the region through Turkey than through Russia, but still there is so much ambivalence there that it's very hard to see it from the logic of what's going on now. However, if we would look at this region from Patrick's question perspective, that if we see this post-Soviet space in terms of ongoing disintegration of the Soviet Union, maybe the long-term strategy is to finish that disintegration, because we today, at another panel, we saw statistics of how over 50% of Russian elite are from communist nomenclatura in Soviet time. If we look in Russians' politics toward its neighbors, we also can use the word revanchism, and it's a post-Soviet revanchism. If we look at local regimes, it's the same thing. In Azerbaijan, the regime remained kind of the same since the whole Soviet Union. With Georgia and Armenia, they are very still connected to Russia. Armenia is really tied with Russia economically and politically. And also we can see military bases all around post-Soviet states, and with local elites like these two little enclaves that I talked about today, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they had 5 elections. They changed their elections, so you would have this illusion that they had 3 elections. But the problem is that everybody elected was a former KGB officer. So it's like, it's a very complicated picture, and maybe once this disintegration, post-Soviet disintegration ends and we stop using that term, maybe that's the long-term solution.
Thank you. And then Mary, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, just really quickly in response to that, USIP doesn't really have an official position, except that we're for peace. We try to prevent conflict, we try to mitigate conflict, we try to resolve conflict. That said, we've been working on building up our Russia and Europe team and what we're working on, and we've been looking at some of these other conflicts in areas like Nagorno-Karabakh. And I would note my boss, Ambassador Bill Taylor, he keeps telling us we don't study things, we don't study conflicts, we don't study problems because we want to admire them, but because we want to find solutions for them. So what we're going to do is continue working on these conflicts, understanding them better, and then helping to work to resolve them.
Well, that's an optimistic conclusion, so please join me in that.